Some readers are puzzled that, in the midst of communism's rise in Latin America, I would turn away from such explosive current events to engage here, and in other publications, in an apparently untimely attack on Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment. Some even suspect that I've developed a grudge against the little hunchback from Königsberg because of his physical resemblance to the one from Turin, Antonio Gramsci. But I hold nothing against little hunchbacks, except when they are inwardly enormous monsters. In my previous article, I briefly described the latter. His German predecessor may seem far less dangerous. He often appears in the media with the cheerful features of a lover of peace and freedom. No one can deny that he truly was these things. But in philosophy, words do not carry their usual dictionary meaning. They refer instead to fully developed, specific concepts. When we examine what Kant meant by peace and freedom, knowing that today's would-be rulers of the world understand those terms the same way, we can't help but notice that the resemblance between the philosopher and the founder of the Italian Communist Party is not only anatomical, but also moral, particularly in the ability both had to beautify, with idealistic language, the ugliest historical realities they were preparing to sow in the soil of the future. Broadly speaking, the growing and increasingly organized influence of intellectuals in global centers of power and the widespread adoption of cultural warfare as the primary instrument of domination have made politics incomprehensible to anyone unable to closely track the development of ideas. It is a deadly illusion to imagine that a separate, practical sphere still exists, apart from cultural, religious, and philosophical debate. Politicians and business leaders who once proudly called themselves pragmatists, scoffing at the supposedly Byzantine discussions of academics, are today a dying breed. To destroy them, it is enough for the activist intelligentsia to design strategies that lie entirely beyond the short-sighted horizon of their practical mindset. The victory of Gramscism in Brazil is largely explained by the intellectual indolence of political and business leaders outside the left. In the United States, nothing is debated in Congress, decided in court, or executed in the White House without first passing, often long before, through the scrutiny of think tanks, where heavyweight intellectuals create the categories of thought that later guide all public discourse. If you try to follow the unfolding of events without understanding the deep intellectual premises behind power struggles, you'll end up understanding nothing. One of those premises is Kant's philosophy. Expressed in a tortuous style that repels even philosophy students, it is the last thing a practical man would care about, which is precisely why it becomes reality right under their noses, without them having the slightest idea where it might be leading them. A few observations are enough to highlight the gravity of the matter. First, Kant's notion of perpetual peace, so capable of seducing sentimental souls with its vague biblical resonance, means nothing other than world government. In a very important study, La Face Cachée de l'ONU, Paris, edition Sarment Fayard, 2000, Father Michael Scuyens, a Belgian philosopher who once taught in Brazil, shows that the new standardizing legislations the UN has been imposing on the world, such as the mandatory pro-abortion measures I referred to in a previous article, are directly inspired by Kant. The global government the UN is rapidly constructing is a precise juridical translation of what Kant meant by human community. According to the philosopher, this community arises spontaneously from the fact that all humans share the same faculty of reason. But reason, for Kant, is not the same as it was for the ancients and medievals. They understood it as the simple gift of speech and coherent thought, a distant reflection of the divine reason that created and sustains the world. Thanks to this gift, the human being could grasp something of the divine and cosmic order of the world and shape the life of the soul according to it, within the limits of human capacity. For Kant, by contrast, reason is the supreme and unsurpassable legislative authority, beholden neither to a pre-existing divine order nor to any facts of the real world that don't conform to its own sovereign self-regulation. Students of the history of philosophy know that the Enlightenment, in general, was marked by its glorification of abstract universality and by a thorough disdain for the variety of singular facts. During the French Revolution, thousands of singular heads were chopped off in order to align the remaining ones with the beautiful universality of reason. Kant loved it. His rigid, abstract moralism knew no bounds. Now imagine the result of turning this into the guiding principle of world order. Eliminating nations that don't conform to the perfection of the new global order would be as easy as guillotining dissidents. If Colombian culture, for example, resists abortion out of fidelity to its Christian roots, then international credit is cut off from Colombia, just as the poet André Chenier or the physicist Lavoisier once had their heads cut off. This is already happening, and it is a solution all the more tempting because the Colombian government is currently waging a successful war against drug trafficking, which the emerging global order would rather legalize as legitimate commerce. A vast campaign in that direction is subsidized by Mr. George Soros, who simultaneously invests heavily in building the new order and buying land in Colombia. For those seeking to fit the planet into a uniform legal mold, crushing dissenters with the righteous conscience of an apostle of perpetual peace, nothing is more inspiring than Kant's abstract doctrines. But long before he began infusing these malignant ideas into the heads of Geneva's bureaucrats, Kant had already inflicted irreparable harm on human intelligence. By consecrating the empire of uniform reason over the multiplicity of facts, he created the scientific dogmatism that enables entire continents of reality to be abolished under the pretext that they are resistant to scientific study, while granting, in turn, to that very science, which admits its inability to study them, the authority to declare they do not exist. This idolatry of method has produced results both tragic and absurd. One of them was the epidemic of anthropological charlatanism in the 20th century. Relying on Kant's premise that no value judgment can be deduced from a factual judgment, and no factual judgment from a value, naive social scientists professed an ascetic abstention from passing moral judgments on the cultural realities they studied. From this vow of chastity, they eventually drew the conclusion that, in this field, value differences did not exist at all. The equality of cultures before the supreme Kantian reason has now become a dogma, imposed on all nations by the politically correct pedagogues of the UN. The bibliography dedicated to persuading the world, for instance, that Aztec rituals of human sacrifice were just as respectable as Franciscan charity, is beyond measure. When Professor Peter Singer resolutely affirms the human rights of chickens, extending to differences between animal species the same precept that was so successful in the realm of cultural differences, he is being thoroughly Kantian. From the same inspiration comes that sublime rule: since genetic science cannot detect any difference between a human being and a chimpanzee at 3 months of gestation, then human beings are not really different from chimpanzees. Empowered by Kant's authority, each science believes itself authorized to proclaim that whatever lies beyond the reach of its methods is perfectly non-existent. Any janitor knows that a human embryo, once grown, may become a Plato or a Michelangelo, and that no chimpanzee embryo can expect a similarly promising future. But since embryology does not study anything that happens to embryos after they stop being embryos, this difference is Kantianly abolished in favor of the sovereignty of method. And long ago, the suppression of that difference ceased to be a mere academic speculation, it became law. And the heads that this law continues to roll are not those of chimpanzees or chickens. Another incalculable harm that Kantianism has inflicted upon humanity is the rigid, stereotyped separation between science and religion. According to Kant, the former concerns what we can know, while the latter concerns only what we can hope for, that is, wish for and imagine. In short, it's the distinction between knowledge and belief. A scientific theory can be proven or refuted. A religious doctrine, you either believe or don't believe, without any possibility of rational arbitration. This distinction penetrated so deeply into the Western soul that it ultimately shaped the everyday use of those terms in the media, in schools, and in both public and private discourse. It is perhaps the most successful terminological dogma of all time. Even in the automation of the unconscious, religion has become simply faith and nothing more. But this is a puerile and unsustainable concept, a complete absurdity. No religion in the world begins with belief. Every religion begins with a series of facts that mark the sudden and humanly inexplicable collective penetration into a higher sphere of reality, from which all existence appears transfigured with new meaning. I say facts because that is exactly what they are. The crossing of the Red Sea may have become a matter of belief for subsequent generations, but for those who lived through the event, it was nothing of the sort. Jesus Christ could say to the blind and the paralyzed whom he healed, "Your faith has saved you." But that is pure metonymy. If the healing were a matter of faith alone, and not a fact within the physical order, it would be a fraud, nothing more. As time passes and the living memory of witnesses fades, access to those facts may require some faith, but it makes no sense to confuse the nature of a fact with the way it is known centuries later. Either those miracles happened, or they didn't. Shifting the problem into the remote past is just evading the issue. 76% of American physicians today believe in miraculous healings because they witness them daily and know they are even more frequent than healing through conventional therapeutic means. When people asked Jesus Christ whether he was truly the one sent by God or if they should wait for another, he didn't answer with a doctrine to be believed or disbelieved, but with facts to be confirmed or challenged. See Matthew 11 verses 1 to 6. Religions only become a matter of belief for audiences that are very far removed, in time or space, from their original sources. Direct knowledge and the scientifically responsible study of miraculous events are the only intellectually valid pathways to religion. The rest is just empty chatter among ignorant talkers sitting at the margins of reality. Nowadays, however, any event deemed miraculous is automatically removed from official discourse, unless it turns out to be a fraud or illusion, which is to say, only when it is demonstrably not miraculous and can be explained away through some cheap psychologism or sociologism. With inconvenient facts expelled, Kantian reason reigns supreme in its mole hole. Kantianism, sanctification of the intellectual cowardice that flees from everything it does not know, blocks the very possibility of ever coming to know it. No dogmatic authoritarianism in history has ever been as petty or as destructive as this one. In future articles, I will present examples of its disastrous effects on culture, history, and moral life. For now, I ask only that no one come to me with that soft talk about Kant having had the best of intentions, or that it was all the fault of overzealous and misunderstanding disciples. The perverse consequences of Kantianism, like those of Hegelianism and Marxism, did not appear centuries or millennia later. They followed almost immediately. A thinker who deems himself capable of turning the entire universe of human knowledge inside out has no excuse for ignoring the most obviously foreseeable effects of the dissemination of his ideas. It is indecent to move from supreme intellectual arrogance to the whimpers of feigned innocence. That indulgence cannot be granted to Kant, just as it cannot be granted to Hegel, Karl Marx, or even Nietzsche, madness notwithstanding. Whoever claims to have grasped the full meaning of human history is strictly obliged to correctly foresee the next episode, at least in regard to his own limited sphere of personal influence. If a man cannot even manage that, it's because he hasn't reached the fullness of philosophical self-awareness exemplified by a Plato, an Aristotle, a Thomas Aquinas, or a Leibniz. And in that case, it is only out of idolatrous devotion that we go on calling him a great philosopher instead of merely an interesting thinker.